Good evening and welcome to today's program, Devil's Contract with Ed Simon and Mark Lilla, as they discuss the Faustian bargain that has plagued our collective imaginations from time immemorial. We are also delighted to have you join us tonight at Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library, the largest circulating branch of New York Public Library. And my name is Ali Weissman, and I'm a librarian at this branch, World Languages Collections. And I will be your host this evening. Before I introduce tonight's panelists, I would like to thank Stavros Niarchos Foundation, Centro Primo Levi New York, and especially Natalia Indrimi for making this evening's program possible. I would also like to remind everyone that if you still don't have a library card, it's easy to get one by visiting any information desk in our building or by speaking with one of my colleagues outside this room after the program. Our, I would also, well, it does require a deal. I would also like to encourage you to visit the New York Public Library website and take a look at other upcoming Seven Stories Up programs. We have an excellent lineup this season, including events about New York, about new nonfiction, art, music, and more. We would love to have you join us in this space again. And now, without further ado, I would like to call to the podium Natalia Indrimi, the director of Centro Primo Levi. Natalia.
Well, I'd like to thank Ellie and the entire staff of the library. We are always thrilled to collaborate with the New York Public Library. This is the place of New Yorkers, the place where people from all backgrounds meet, and there would be no better place for us to present our programs and to share the organization of them. So I'd like to say just a few words about tonight's books. At the center, we have followed Ed Simon's work, and for some time, we really admire the breadth and depth of his interest, and is a way to escape like a hyper-specialization that is increasingly characterizing our society, our culture. And when he told me that he was completing a book about the Faustian legend, I was really intrigued because the references he made are topics that are central to Primo Levi's work. In particular, the rise of fascism from the experiment of nation building and the shifting of the balance toward nationalism, the many compromises that led to the First and then the Second World War, and disasters that had never been imaginable in the previous, with all the wars that Europe had, but they were beyond any imagination. And then the continuation, the rise of the technocratic society past the Second World War that, as the philosopher Gunther Anders observed when he arrived to this country in 1940, was really the contribution of Nazism to the future, and something that, in fact, stayed alive extremely well. So topics like the atomic bombs, the destruction of the planet, the many compromises that on individual level and collective level we do all the time to maintain power and maintain the comfort of our society, because indeed we do live in a very comfortable society, are inscribed by Ed in the legend of Faust. Now, this, of course, never occurred to, I think, is a direction that Primo Levi never took. It never occurred to me that, although obviously the Faustian Pact is a very strong reference, but that we could inscribe an entire course of events and the very soul of our present into this myth. Is an ancient myth. And by the way, this is like before Faust. Another person made a compromise to obtain knowledge, and was Eve. And I'm not sure that they ended up in the same way. And then I leave you with this question: what does inscribing all these events and the current dilemmas and the crisis that we're facing into the story of Faust add to our knowledge? And what does it add to our ability to possibly act on it? And I leave the stage to our wonderful speakers. I'll say a few words on them. Ed Simon is the Public Humanities Special Faculty in the English Department of Carnegie Mellon University and the editor-in-chief of Belt Magazine. His essays and criticism have appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Paris Review Daily, the New Republic, and the Washington Post. Mark Lilla is professor of the humanities at Columbia University and a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books. Among his books are The Reckless Mind, Intellectuals in Politics, and the forthcoming Ignorance and Bliss, On Wanting Not to Know. And this last book, I think, it makes a very appropriate sequel to a reflection on the Faustian Pact. Please welcome to the stage Ed Simon and Mark Lilla. Thank you.
Why, Martin Luther supposedly asked, does the devil get all of the good tunes? What I'd like to endeavor in the next few minutes are some fractured notes on Satan's melodiousness, alongside that of his most faithful emissary, the magician Dr. Faustus. As such, I can offer some of the major arguments in my book, Devil's Contract, The History of the Faustian Bargain. Most often associated with the 16th century necromancer Johann Faust, who was later fictionalized in the Elizabethan playwright Christopher Marlowe's eponymous play and the late 18th century poem by Goethe, Tales of the Devil's Contract involve somebody exchanging their immortal soul for some gain, whether political or romantic, financial or professional, or, of course, supernatural. Thousands of plays and poems, novels and stories, films and musical compositions have explored this tale in a diversity of ways and to different ends. But the skeletal narrative remains, I would argue, among the most important stories ever told. The story of Faust is an intimately human story. Scholar Jeffrey Burton Russell writes in his classic study Mephistopheles, The Devil in the Modern World, that the figure of Faust is, after Christ, Mary, and the devil, the single most popular character in the history of Western Christian culture. In his arrogance and his failure, his negotiations and his capitulations, in the whole litany of abuse which the cankered soul is capable of inflicting upon itself, Faust is the most fully human character to his readers among the litany mentioned by Russell. His contention is far from hyperbole, and amending the word character to narrative, I'd say that there are a few archetypal scripts in our culture as essential as the legend of a man selling his soul to the devil. Thousands of works of literature and film, music and art grapple with the bargain whereby somebody trades what's most human for power or wealth, influence or knowledge. Only the myth of Adam and Eve being cast out of Eden competes with Faust in terms of influence, and that story is arguably an earlier variation on the Devil's Contract anyhow. Nor are Marlowe and Goethe's renditions the final word, as thousands of permutations of the basic story have been produced over the half-millennium, from Goethe to Damn Yankees, Thomas Mann to the Dixie-fried paplum of the execrable Charlie Daniels band number The Devil Went Down to Georgia. High culture, like Franz Liszt's Faust Symphony and Gustav Mahler's Symphony No. 8, pop culture from the comic book Ghost Rider to the Jack Black flick Tenacious D in the Pick of Destiny. The story of the devil's contract has been among the most enduring in our culture, and that leads into my next point. If the devil's contract remains so crucial to us, it's because Faust's tale is particularly human. Faust's story is your story, my story as well. Any accounting of Faust's history is, at its core, an autobiography. Faust is a character who is outside of time, who lives parallel to past, present, and future. His is an eternal story. Because what this book is concerned with are the implications, culturally, politically, theologically, of these highly symbolically charged narratives concerning the abjuration of a soul, of the ceding of what's intrinsic to us, of the capitulations and negotiations which make up any failed life, which is to say, every life. More than a history, then, Devil's Contract is an account of what it means to be human in all of our failings. I want frenzied excitements, gratifications that are painful, Faust tells Mephistopheles in Goethe's version, love and hatred violently mixed. The work of Goethe's entire life, his Faustian drama, is dedicated to the romantic desire for experience and energy, fullness and feeling, in which what is created is not a separate work of art, but the life itself. As in Marlowe and his predecessors, Faust is a cloistered scholar who signs a contract with Mephistopheles for his eternal soul, but what Goethe's Faust wants in exchange is rather different. This Faust thirsts for anguish that enlivens, inspiriting trouble. From now on my wish is to undergo all that men everywhere undergo, their whole portion, make mine their heights and depths, their weal and woe, everything human encompass in my single person, and so enlarge my one self to embrace theirs all. It's as if the classical poet Terence's humanistic injunction to let nothing which is human be foreign to us was pushed to its utter extreme. What Faust envisions is being transformed into a singularity of all people, a monad reflecting all our species' baroque glories and degradation within a single life. Thus, the very act of living becomes a form of art, a type of incantation. Living in all its complexities understood as magic. Because for all of the various ways in which Faust may be understood as a magician, a wizard, a type of scientist, he is primarily an artist, which is to say that his magic deals in illusions just as with a novelist, a playwright, a film director. For example, Marlowe's play's most overwhelming anxiety concerns its preoccupation with illusion, with the vocation of the writer as a new priest. If the Marlowean ethos is that storytelling itself is literal magic and the author the mage of this imaginative learning, then there is a profound danger in these skills. Insomuch as Dr. Faustus is about heresy, it's really about illusion, and only incidentally about how the latter can inculcate the former. Was this the face that launched 1,000 ships and burnt the topless towers of Ilium? Faust asks Helen of Troy. But no, it's not the face that launched 1,000 ships, regardless of how full and red her lips are or how flaxen her hair is. This is a succubus made to appear as Helen. Have I not made blind Homer sing to me, says Faust again. No, that was not the blind Greek bard strumming his lyre, but another demon made to trick and cajole. The same fear of illusion exists in how we think about film. The Faustian narrative has always evoked commerce. The central conceit of the fable is the signing of a contract, after all. Yet even if Mephistopheles is riven through all of capitalist interaction, from the manager to the laborer, the producer to the consumer, eternally buying and selling back and forth for profits gained and souls lost and biomes destroyed along the way, the nature of the entertainment industry can't help but feel even more on point. It's a bit abstract to say that the production of lug nuts and gears is Faustian, even if it is, but the manufacture of fantastical, dreamlike illusions rendered on celluloid 2 stories high or available anywhere on Earth via the silicon oracle in your pocket would have been rightly judged as powerful magic by our ancestors. Mass media as a form of manipulation shifts me to my next insight, and that's that the Faustian tale is particularly adept at allegorizing totalitarian politics. German novelist Thomas Mann, in his variation on the tale, writes that popular myths, or better, myths trimmed for the masses, would be the vehicle of political action. Fables, chimeras, phantasms that needed to have nothing whatever to do with truth, reason, or science in order to be productive nonetheless, to determine life and history, and thereby to prove themselves dynamic realities. If fascism aestheticizes politics, as Walter Benjamin had claimed, then Dr. Faustus is an allegory of the dangers of illusion, of the way in which such enchantments can suddenly exert their own dark power over material circumstances. Fascism is the politics of the Faustian bargain, the national soul exchanged for fantasies of the nation made great again. Totalitarianism posited a world that was nothing but specters, a grim Gehenna, a shadowy Sheol, that such evil had no need for a devil, that it was the product of human emotion and human aspiration and human desires. That was Satan's greatest lesson for the 20th century. Like a proud parent, Mephistopheles must dab at moist eyes as Faust matures, content to learn that his wickedness can be found within his own stained soul. The most Faustian of political systems, totalitarianism demands the payment of freedom in exchange for the feeling of incomparable power. Ironically, the ultimate valorization of the individual, where every member of the party is as if a crepuscular atom in the great leviathan of the dictator himself, whether he is the voice of the people or the avatar of the race. That is the great analytical failure of rational bourgeois politics, whether left, liberal, or conservative. They're unable to recognize the threat of the fascist devil because they can't recognize the devil. They don't smell the sulfur or see his pointed tooth sneer unless he's already clawing at their throats. Finally, Faust's tale is increasingly an account of humanity right now. For all the legend's archaicism, the muttered Latin, and the alchemical conjuration, Faust's story has always been estimably modern, perhaps the first modern story. Unlike Adam and Eve, with their inscrutable Bronze Age story, composed in an idiom so ancient and foreign that centuries of theologians have disagreed on what the implications of each facet of the tale might mean, the details in the Faust legend are inescapably of our time. The contract, once again. Most versions of the Faust story involve the signing of a legally binding document, an experience foreign to the authors of Genesis, but replete in our own lives, whether interacting with human resources or clicking on an agreement with our phone company. Faust's tale may deal in the numinous and the transcendent, but it's also about bureaucracy and paperwork, our contemporary hell and its sacrament, respectively. We recognize Faust in a manner that no character in the Bible can ever be our contemporary. An issue of signing on the dotted line is superficiality when it comes to Faust's significance to modern readers, however, because more than any other myth, the tale of the devil's contract is a succinct encapsulation of the human predicament over the past 5 centuries, right as modernity was gestated, born, thrived, and is now in the throes of its own death. In my book, I call our present day the Faustocene, for never have the immoral negotiations and intransigent capitulations of our broken society been clearer, never has the light of our illusions and the sound of our spectacles been more entertaining, even as the temperature rises and as the shoreline disappears. Riven by its own catastrophic contradictions, the Faustocene is an age of cold rationality and fervent occultism, of unfeeling irreligiosity and zealous fundamentalism. An age marked by the ability to change and alter the world, to create illusions and demonstrate the illusions of reality itself, to finally call God's bluff, but to establish a hell in the interim where magic and technology become indistinguishable. Half the hour is past, Marlowe's Faust cried, and it grows very close to midnight. Everything in Western hubris has been leading to this moment, our age of ChatGPT-3 and deepfakes, of wildfires and heat bulbs. All the overweening arrogance, rapacious hunger, and wrathful domination, the desire for power disguised as a thirst for knowledge driving us towards this final act of our Faustian play. What I posit is that perhaps it's time to seriously consider those old legends, lest we obscure our own possibilities at redemption. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Ed. I'm glad to be here, and I have to say that I was happy to accept the invitation before I'd read the book, but it really absorbed me when I read it. But in my questions to begin with, I'd like to focus on the beginning of the book. You focused on the end, your conclusion, but for me, just given my own interests, I'd like to talk a bit about the theology, explicit or implicit, in some of the Faustian myths, and get you to speak a little bit about that. To begin with, you begin with Gnosticism.
As one does.
As one does normally badly.
Yeah.
It's very hard to talk about it, and there's even a scholarly debate as to whether it existed, and many people here may not know even what we're talking about. Can you just super briefly say what you mean in the book by Gnosticism and how that gets you started?
Sure. So I think you make a very good point about the kind of disagreements about how helpful the term Gnosticism is. Because before I sort of elaborate on what it is a term that kind of throws a variety of tremendously diverse movements, oftentimes contradictory from one another, into the same kind of hodgepodge of things where it might not be fair to say they're all the same phenomenon. But very broadly, what we're talking about with Gnosticism is a species of Christian heresy from the first few centuries of the Common Era. And very, very broadly, again, with lots of diversity there, the major common belief, if we can identify one, is that our world that we live in and that we experience in this reality is not the creation of a good God. It's the creation of a demiurge. It's a creation of this kind of lesser malevolent deity who they associate with the devil. So in many ways, the Gnostics kind of see our very existence as a type of Faustian bargain to an extent. I connect it to Simon Magus, who's another figure who, as with most things during this time period, may or may not have been a real person, may have been three people merged together, something like that. But Simon Magus, as the kind of arch heretic, is oftentimes identified as the father of Gnosticism, even though he most definitely was not. But he is a figure who, according to the Book of Acts, where he's mentioned in the canonical scripture, and then in this kind of voluminous apocryphal literature, is a figure who becomes baptized so he can perform magic. So he's this kind of interesting...
And magic being the charismatic gifts of the Bible,
Exactly.
healing, things like that.
Exactly, as well as levitation. So he threw that in there. He was big on levitating, Simon Magus. But it's interesting because he's so obviously a type of Faustian figure, but the thing that he kind of sells his soul to is God. So there's this very uncomfortable kind of narrative aspect there where it does kind of prefigure these later legends, but with what it implies about divinity and the sacred and so on.
Now, the study of the concept of Gnosticism really sort of got a new life beginning in the 19th century in German scholarship, but especially in the 20th century, because many saw ancient Gnosticism as more than just something from a period, but a kind of instinct that played out in totalitarianism, in the philosophy of Heidegger. And so there's a lot of writing about Gnosticism, Eric Voegelin, about the modern age being...
Norman Cohn's work.
Exactly. And so there has been an attempt to bring it into the present, and Ed, in his own way, does this. But the idea that, the world we live in isn't the right world and it's ruled by a demiurge, you would think is just a kind of idiosyncratic belief without many implications. But it means a couple of things. One is that the ultimate God, or the one, is beyond an unknowable. Right? And so there's nothing to do religiously to have communication. Instead, we're stuck with this sort of this bad God that somehow gets born out of the good God and creates the world, making sure that we suffer. And because of that, we also have no one to turn to. And so the hope in Gnosticism is that in enough people, there are sort of little shards of the divine that still exist in their souls. And through Gnostic rituals and paying for special workshops, as we would say today, you would
TED
learn.
Talks,
You would learn how to develop this thing. And one day, when all these forces come together, the present world will be abolished, and we will all become in part of the one. Okay, now that has interesting implications that you really draw out, and that is that you put God and the devil at the same level. Do you want to elaborate on that for a second? I mean, essentially, you treat them as two mafia dons. Sort of one is Vito Corleone and the other one is Tony Soprano. But essentially, they're both just looking for payment.
It's a very kind of Manichaean take. I don't know if that's necessarily. I think that what I find interesting about the idea of Simon Magus selling his soul to God is it's a reminder that when we talk about the devil, or we talk about wickedness, or we talk about demons, or what have you, that they are, though obviously different or diametrically opposed to the God of good or what have you, they're still evidence of the sacred, right? Like they're still, they are things from a world that is beyond our profane existence. And I sometimes wonder if that's some of our culture's fascination with horror or with questions of evil or whatever. It's kind of like in a godless age, the way we get God is through his adversary almost, right? If you think about the kind of obsession that people have with, the various Faustian contract movies that I talk about in the book, or The Exorcist or whatever, is that sort of horror is kind of an interesting, I think it's an interesting exercise in the sacred to an extent. Certainly, there are traditions that kind of posit God and the devil as kind of roughly equal adversaries, right? And that's the aforementioned Manichaean kind of way of viewing things. In terms of my own take on it, I'm agnostic, I think, or it depends on the day of the week, maybe what I think.
Yeah, but if you compare them, I mean, both of them require payment every month, right? They require things that are burned, in the case of the God of the Hebrew Bible, and require prayers, require obedience.
Yeah.
So then the question is, and both of them promise the possibility of a good life.
Yes.
Right? Whereas the devil only promises hell at the end. God says, depending on how you behave, we'll see. Right? But otherwise, you also mentioned the book of Job, where God and the devil are also playing with us in their own kind of little racket.
And the book of Job is for many reasons, is such a remarkable book, because in some ways, it's a Faustian bargain in which the mark is God himself, right? I mean, the strange narrative drama of the book of Job is that Job doesn't know why God does all of these heinous things to him, and God comes out of the whirlwind and basically says, shut up, I created, the world and Leviathan and all these amazing things you can't understand. Who are you to question me? But we, as the readers, know precisely why God did it, and God basically did it because the devil told him to, right? Which is such I think it's why it's such an exemplary and fascinating book, because of how disturbing the theological implications of it are in that regard.
Yeah. What then derives from Gnosticism in your account is the need for magic, because the rules of nature, if physical existence is something bad, that means that the laws of nature are malevolent, right? That things have been set up so we suffer. And then human beings get the idea, well, if we can find the user's manual, right?
Yeah.
Which is not just how things work here, but the way God moves things, that we can start to determine our own destiny, and that human beings will finally become independent and have dignity. And you find this, I think you mentioned him, but I'm not sure, in Francis Bacon.
Yes.
And you talked about the role of magic in early science, and maybe you could say something about that.
Yeah, it's one of the fascinating things about the evolution of science. The scientific revolution during the early modern period, thinking really about it during the 17th century onward, and so much of early scientific discourse is indebted to, basically magical thinking, and it's something that in scholarship people have written about really since Dame Frances Yates, who's writing in like the 1960s. But the popular account is still kind of this idea that, science is this Enlightenment project that banishes the darkness of the superstitious Middle Ages and, ever and onward with progress, right? Whereas the reality is just a little bit more complicated. These things are kind of intermixed in confusing or strange or interesting kinds of ways. And the standard example that people always give of the kind of ways in which early empirical scientists in kind of the modern vein had this supernatural obsession is the career of Isaac Newton, who, after all, was most interested in alchemy and Bible prophecy and Christian Kabbalah, and the theory of gravitation and motion and calculus were like side things for him, really. And there's a lot of ways in which the philosophy of science, as opposed to science itself, still has those kind of hallmarks of a sort of magical or maybe even Gnostic way of thinking. And that's why Bacon is so important here. Because Bacon, though he is a scientist, is not a particularly important one in the grand scheme of things. He's not, the equivalent of Isaac Newton by any means, but he's a crucial theorist of science. And in, the New Order and the New Atlantis, he expresses a type of ideology of science as this ever-progressive force that can improve people's lives that may or may not be based in empirical reality, but as he expresses it, it bears a lot of similarity to what you just described in terms of the kind of Gnostic idea of kind of gaming the system. Yeah. We just call gaming the system of reality technology now instead of magic.
Right. Well, here I think with Bacon and just more generally with the modern sciences, you see a connection, for the purposes of your book, between the Faust myth and the... Hang on a second, I have to formulate this right. Between the Faust myth and the notion, and the Promethean myth, right? Because Bacon speaks in many voices, and sometimes he says, oh, this is all consistent with Christianity, and then he writes something about Prometheus saying, wow, that's what we're looking for here, right? And so, the story's also embedded, your story, in the relation between Zeus and Prometheus.
Absolutely, yeah. Prometheus is one of those kind of, you feel like kernels of Faust, I think, before Faust proper, right? And, that's why in my talk at the beginning I say even Adam and Eve have this kind of Faustian feel to it. So this idea of a contract that is entered into with a supernatural entity that gives you some things but then takes away a lot of things. That's really an enduring archetype. As unpopular as the term archetype is in literary theory for 50 years, it is a useful one here, I think.
Yeah. Well, let's get to the Faustian myth that I think most people in the West are most familiar with, and that's not Marlowe, but Goethe's, right? Nietzsche hated Goethe's Faust, part 2, even part 1 at the ending. Why? Because at the end of volume 1, Gretchen is brought into heaven, and at the end of part 2, Faust is forgiven. which takes away all the drama and the potential tragedy. Goethe calls it a tragedy, Goethe's Faustus, the tragedy. But there is a weirdly Christian happy ending. And I wonder if that is significant in a way, in sort of burying the radical potential in the Faustian bargain, so that we think that we can have a Faustian bargain with a happy ending, with no tragic ending or radical choice we have to make.
That's a fantastic question. I think that, it's notable that Goethe's version, it's certainly the most prominent one that has a happy ending. I don't know that I can authoritatively say it's the first that does, but there is, I think, the end of that work is never entirely convincing, I think, to most people I get the logic behind why that happens in the way that it does, but there is an aspect of it that feels kind of tacked on or something. And I didn't actually know Nietzsche's dislike of that, but I'm not surprised at all. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense to me. I think that one of the things that makes Faust interesting, the story, from a purely kind of narrative standpoint, is the idea that there might be a potential for a happy ending, but then that there isn't, right? And I think I go back to, I'm a early modernist by training, English early modern literature, and one of the things I'm so fascinated by in Marlowe's play in particular, because it exists, not to do too much inside baseball, but it exists in two different texts, two different versions. Yeah. And there's this earlier version that comes out in the early 1590s, and there's one that comes out 10 years after his death. And there's all sorts of important textual differences between them. But one of the big differences, and I'm paraphrasing here, someone like butcher the actual quote, but in the earlier version it says something along the lines of, if Faustus could save himself. And then 10 years later it becomes, if Faustus would save himself. And there's all sorts of historical reasons for that in terms of changing theological beliefs in the Church of England and yada, yada, yada. But what I think is so interesting is what it says about freedom and agency. So I'm fascinated by the idea of a Faust that could, in some way, has the ability that he would, save himself, and then he chooses not to. But I do think actually enacting dramatically that kind of salvation, there is something, especially the way Goethe does it, that's just unfulfilling.
Yeah. Well, I guess I see it in a different light, and that is, in the way Nietzsche looked at the birth and death of tragedy, right, is that Christianity has trouble dealing with both the Hebrew and the Christian scriptures have no comedy or tragedy, right? Everything can be explained, right? And has a reason somehow in relation to God. And eventually there's a good outcome to things. It's rare to find, you do find in the Hebrew scriptures some, certainly Lamentations.
Job, certainly, right?
That's for sure, yeah. Well, Job gets a new set of kids,
yeah,
but he doesn't get his old
but
kids
they're,
back.
They're the same.
No, I know. But I wonder if the happy ending version of Faust in Goethe signals not so much a potential that was already there, but whether it's part of this turn away from the tragic. And the idea
in a cultural sense, you mean this kind of like
yeah, and the notion that human life requires choices and there are no benefits without costs. But the modern sciences have been presented to us as, in a sense, costless, right? And of course we know it's not, but that hasn't been built into the story of science. If you go to a history of science class, it does not begin with the original tragic Faust.
Yeah.
No, this is all working out. We all get better off and all the rest.
Sure.
What do you think of that?
I actually really like that connection. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think thinking of Goethe, too, specifically as this kind of figure with a, conflicted and complicated relationship to the Enlightenment and kind of straddling the Enlightenment and the Romantic. I think that, one could posit that one of the great tragedies of the contemporary era is the idea, as you've said, I think, is you can benefit from selling your soul without the damnation, right? That's the real danger of the myth. And you make a really cognizant point when you talk about the kind of triumphalist history of science, that sort of the standard story that a lot of people hear, that, there's obvious reasons for it, because the scientific method has been tremendous with what it's been able to do. But to pretend that all of that comes without a cost is also kind of an unthinking adherence to a different type of faith.
Yeah, I guess I would put it just in a formula that the tragedy is the, covering up or occlusion of the fundamentally tragic nature of human existence, which gets captured, in the original, so that we're not able to articulate, we don't have a vocabulary or an imaginary structure to make sense of the bargain we're making with modern science. Yeah.
I know. I think
because of histories of progress and all that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I would very much agree with that.
Yeah. Maybe it's time to turn to the audience and see what kind of questions we have. Someone will come around with microphones. You just have to hold your hands incredibly high so they can see you. Someone's coming. We're going to start with the back. Go ahead.
Inverse of a Faustian bargain, you were talking about God versus the devil,
Sure.
would be like religious martyrdom, and then or Socratic martyrdom,
Okay.
and then you're dying for a bigger truth, but you're going to have happiness in the afterlife.
Yeah.
And then the other question is, some scholars have said that has speculated that Goethe was gay. And do you think that in any way might have influenced his interest in either the Faustian bargain or a happy ending of a Faustian bargain? I don't know.
So I guess I'll begin with the question that I can't answer, and then make up something about the one that I kind of can. So in terms of like Goethe's biography and the influence, I don't know enough about it. I would imagine. I mean, look, every author is impacted by all sorts of things, known and unknown to themselves and others, I guess. So certainly, I guess that's possible, but I wouldn't really have a sense of it. In terms of the first question you asked, I do think that the idea of martyrdom as an inverse of the Faustian bargain is a fascinating one, and I like the adjective that you used there, where you said it's about somebody dying for something bigger than themselves, right? Because the Faustian bargain is very much about dying for something that is smaller than yourself, right? You're selling your soul for this type of impious gain, right? And you really have kind of two different models of individuality there, and you have two different models of power in some ways. And this is one of the things I talk about early in the book as well, is I think of Christ's temptation in the desert as a type of failed Faustian bargain. I was waiting for that to like really piss off theologians, and I was disappointed that I didn't get more angry emails. But what I was thinking of there is that the scene in the desert is basically an exegetical argument between Christ and the devil more than it is a traditional Faustian bargain. And what it really is a debate about power. And I think that, is power something that looks like powerlessness and abasement in the manner that kind of the radical ethic of Christianity teaches, or is power the devil's version of power, which is the version of power that all of us think about when we hear the word power, right? And I think your point about martyrdom there fits in really nicely with that sort of contention.
If I can just add about that, because I like that thought, there's a way to think about martyrdom as well as rebellion against God. And certainly the Catholic Church has had problems from this in the beginning. So you get a list of things to do, you do your things, everything's done, but you don't want to stick to that because you've been ordered. So you start having visions, and you see things move at night, and suddenly they're touching people want to come and touch your hand, and you start displaying the stigmata, and eventually you're burned as a witch. In one sense, it's a kind of tragedy of Christianity, but on the other hand, it's a way of sticking it to God, right? This is now my story. This is not your story.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway.
How does this Christianity philosophy work with free will versus predestination, and how does that work into it? And what I never understood is the word heresy. Heresy in Greek means choice. How the hell did that evolve into what people believe it to be?
Well, I think that going back to my, could or would thing, right? I hate to. This is I feel like very much like the archivist who's like, oh, there's two different words, and I have to. But I think that embodies the central tension that you're addressing, right? Is how do we think about what choice Faust necessarily has, right? And there's historical reasons within the church in England at that time that when Marlowe, when the first version came out, the first quarto in the 1590s. Calvinism was very much ascendant in the official church at the time. And so the idea that Faust doesn't really have any agency in that would have been important, or would have been the kind of theologically sound position to make. 10 years later, the Calvinists, for political reasons, are kind of being flushed out of those positions, and suddenly freedom's a possibility again. But I think what the answer to your question is that there is no definite answer to that, right? That its choice and freedom are sort of always contested in these texts, and they sort of move around and have variable meanings all of the time.
What brought me here tonight was that I read Goethe's Faust when I was an undergraduate. I didn't know anything, and now I'm an old man, and I've had a career, and I've made whatever compromises I've had to make, and now I know exactly what he was talking about. What it takes to make partner in a law firm, or tenure in a university, or vice president in a corporation. I mean, you're compelled to make these compromises. You don't have a choice.
Yeah.
It's not the devil that you're dealing with. It's your own ambition, your own need to reach beyond, that's the human condition. I don't think we have it. We don't have a choice. It's not making an error. It's doing the things you need to do in order to survive.
And I think you're absolutely correct with that. And I think that Faust is a tremendously sympathetic character in many ways, precisely because of that, right? One of the things I wanted to try and avoid in the book, and I hope I have, is I didn't want it to be hectoring or moralizing. I wanted there to be an acknowledgement that like I have certainly at various points, to greater and lesser degree compromised my principles or my values, or been, shitty to friends or whatever, for some sort of selfish reason, as I imagine most people have been, right? And I think that's what makes Faust so compelling, is that he's so recognizably human in that way. And that's one of the things when I talk about the Faustocene, is, I wasn't necessarily making a kind of back to the land argument where we're all urban homesteaders or something. I mean, I'm a huge hypocrite with that most of all. I wrote the book on a laptop and then hop in my relatively gas efficient car and drove off to the, wherever. But I think that your point that we don't have a choice is it's very astute, right? We are kind of implicated in this network, this system, where we do feel or are culpable in some way, and it's very hard not to be part of that system. And I think that's what marks our era as particularly Faustian, is that we're kind of made to become Faust in some ways.
I had the same thought that the gentleman did, but it led me to pose a question, and I'll pose it to you.
Sure.
And that is, if making compromises is just part of life, what's special about the Faust story, right? But could it be that in a sense we've made him into a kind of scapegoat, and so you exaggerate that and say, well, there are people who make
Sure.
contracts with the devil, and so he's the bad guy for us.
Yeah.
But in fact, we're implicated all the time.
So it's just kind of like, well, I, betrayed my friend so I could make partner at a law firm, but I did not sell my soul to the devil, sort of thing. Yeah, for sure.
There's incredible number of stories, movies, TV shows, comic books, novels that deal with somebody making a deal with the devil. And sometimes the devil wins, sometimes the person wins. But I think one of the things in all of them, and I think it goes to what you were saying, is that it's the ordinary person versus a super powerful individual. And I'd like to hear you speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a whole category of Faustian legend where you can interpret the story in a radically different way, where Faust is almost like, if he wins, he's almost a rebel against this kind of unjust, the prince of this world, the evil one, right? It's the Chris Christopherson line where he says, I didn't beat the devil, but I drank his beer for free, right? Like this kind of, you can kind of get one over on the devil. That tends to be much more the folkloric Faust legend. It's something that you see in legends and fairy tales and fables, the kind of like high culture with all that's problematic about that term. Variations tend not to do that necessarily as much, though it is kind of a particularly American version of the Faust legend. This kind of fits in, I think, a little bit to what Mark was talking about in terms of the Goethe legend having a positive ending. There are American versions of the Faust story where he gets one over on the devil, right? Not to like quote Charlie Daniels Band in the New York Public Library, but that's if you're familiar with the song where Charlie, who's like a homespun good old boy, outfiddles the devil, right, and he gets to keep the violin of gold. Never mind that who really wants a violin of gold? I imagine you can't play it. And to this day, I still think that the devil did perform the better version in that song.
The devil wins a lot too.
Yeah, oh, for sure. But whenever the devil like loses, it has that kind of Yankee ingenuity, and I think it very much fits into that kind of like myth of scientific progress thing, which grows up alongside American society. My favorite version of the devil being beaten is there's a story about a brigadier general in the Revolutionary War named Thomas Moulton, who is a New Hampshire, he's like the Yankee Faust is literally what they call him. And he signs a contract with the devil where if the devil can't fill up his boots with gold, then Thomas can keep all of the gold. So Thomas then punches out 2 holes in the floor above his root cellar. He puts his boots on without soles. The devil dumps in a tremendous amount of gold, but apparently a finite amount. And this way he's effectively been tricked, and Moulton gets to keep all of the gold. But then when the devil finds out what he's done, he comes back and he burns down his house, which is like not pleasant, but you're not in hell, I guess, right? So it's this weird type of playing with the trope as well that you can see in all of these countless iterations. There's some fascinating variations.
You had brought up the word totalitarianism in terms of the fable and its impact on societies. And I was wondering if we live in a democracy, but I remember having to read books like the Sambo series, which is the most racist, horrific thing you can subject a child to.
Sure.
And I'm wondering what it is about your through line that speaks to that.
That speaks to totalitarian.
Yes.
To specifically, just like in a general sense about.
Relating to what children are reading, what becomes popular culture,
Oh.
in the printed material, and later mass media.
Well, I make a big case out of mass media having a certain Faustian quality to it, and it's not necessarily. I didn't want people to interpret it as like a anti-film or something, because it's definitely not. But I think that the artistic element of the Faustian legend, right, the ability to conjure illusions, is such an important central plank of the legend. And that can also, of course, be used in incredibly detrimental ways. So thinking about the spectacle of propaganda or something, there's a type of dark magic, dark occultism to that sort of thing. And I think that kind of ties into thinking about, totalitarianism is this kind of preeminently modern form of autocracy, right? But it also has these kind of mythic, by design, antecedents that kind of draw a kind of energy from those sorts of stories and that kind of narrative.